The storm hit harder than Richard Everett had expected, turning the country road into a slick ribbon of danger that forced him to pull off at the first sign of civilization he could find. The neon sign flickering through the downpour read, "Franny's Diner" in faded letters, and he didn't care that it looked like it hadn't been updated since 1985. He needed to wait out the worst of the weather, maybe grab a coffee and get back on the road to make his flight from Charleston back to New York. Richard parked his rental sedan next to a beat-up pickup truck and dashed through the rain, his expensive suit jacket pulled over his head uselessly. The door chimed as he stepped inside, and the warmth hit him immediately, along with the smell of coffee and something baking. The place was nearly empty except for an elderly man at the counter and a couple in a corner booth. "Sit anywhere you like, honey." "Be right with you," a woman's voice called from the kitchen. He chose a booth near the window so he could watch for when the rain let up. His phone buzzed with another email from his assistant asking about the acquisition deal he'd just closed. 3 manufacturing plants in the Carolinas now belonged to Everett Holdings, adding to the empire his grandfather had started and his father had expanded. At 32, Richard had already doubled the company's worth in the 5 years since he'd taken over as CEO. This trip had been quick and efficient, just the way he liked things. The woman who emerged from the kitchen made him look up from his phone. She was younger than the voice had suggested, probably mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and an apron tied around her waist. She had flour on her cheek and moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew every inch of the space around her. "Sorry about that, I was in the middle of making pies," she said, pulling out a notepad. "What can I get you?" "Just coffee, black," Richard said, glancing back at his phone. "You sure? The chili is really good today, and with this storm you might be here a while." He looked up at her again. She had green eyes that held his gaze steadily, no hint of the usual nervousness people showed around him once they knew who he was. But of course, she didn't know. Here he was just another traveler in a wet suit. "The storm's supposed to pass soon," he said. She walked to the window and looked out, shaking her head. "I've lived in Millbrook my whole life. That sky says you have got at least 2 hours before it's safe to drive. The roads flood fast around here. Fine, coffee and the chili." She smiled, and it changed her whole face, making her eyes crinkle at the corners. "Good choice." As she walked away, Richard found himself watching her move behind the counter, pouring his coffee with practiced ease. He forced his attention back to his phone, but the emails seemed less urgent somehow. The diner had a timeless quality that made the outside world feel far away. She brought the coffee first, setting it down with a small container of cream, even though he'd said black. "Just in case you change your mind, I won't. Suit yourself." She didn't seem offended, just amused. "You always tell customers they're wrong?" he asked. "Only when they're being stubborn about chili on a day like this. I'm Grace, by the way, Grace Finley. My mom owns this place." "Richard?" "Nice to meet you, Richard. Where you heading in such a hurry?" "Charleston. I have a flight back to New York at 7. Grace glanced at the clock on the wall. It was just past 3. "You'll make it if the storm cooperates." "Where in New York?" "Manhattan." "Never been." "Always wanted to see it, though. The lights, the energy, all of it." "It's loud and crowded," Richard said, though he felt oddly defensive of the city suddenly. "Sounds perfect," Grace said with a grin before heading back to check on the chili. Richard tried to focus on his emails, but he kept glancing up at Grace as she moved through the diner. She refilled the old man's coffee without him asking, laughed at something he said, and then disappeared into the kitchen. When she brought out Richard's chili a few minutes later, the bowl was steaming and came with fresh cornbread on the side. "On the house," she said when he reached for his wallet. First-time customers get the cornbread free. Mom's rule. The chili was excellent, rich and perfectly spiced, and the cornbread melted in his mouth. Richard couldn't remember the last time he'd had a meal this good that didn't come from a restaurant with a Michelin star. "This is really good," he admitted when Grace came by to refill his coffee. "Mom's recipe. She's been making it for 30 years. Grace slid into the booth across from him without asking, taking a break now that the other customers had left. "So what do you do in New York, Richard?" He hesitated. Usually he avoided this question because the answer changed how people treated him, but something about Grace's direct gaze made him want to be honest. "I run a company, manufacturing and distribution." "Sounds impressive. Big company?" "Big enough." Grace tilted her head, studying him. "You're one of those people who doesn't like talking about yourself." "I just don't think it's that interesting." "Everyone's interesting if you ask the right questions," she said. "What do you manufacture?" "Various things. Auto parts, industrial equipment, some consumer goods." "And you like it?" No one had asked him that in years. People asked about profits, about growth, about market share, not whether he liked it. "It's what I do," Richard said finally. "That's not an answer." Before he could respond, an older woman emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She had the same green eyes as Grace and a warm smile that reached them immediately. "Gracie, stop bothering the customers," she said, but there was no heat in it. "He doesn't mind. Do you, Richard?" "No," he said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "I'm Franny, this troublemaker's mother," the older woman said. "How's the chili?" "Best I've had in years." Franny beamed. "High praise, you passing through, just waiting out the storm." "Well, you picked the right place." "Grace, honey, I need you in the kitchen for a minute." Grace stood, giving Richard an apologetic look. "Don't go anywhere. I want to hear more about this company of yours." She disappeared into the kitchen with her mother, and Richard found himself hoping the storm would last a little longer. He pulled up the weather radar on his phone. The system was moving slower than predicted. He'd have to leave by 5 to make his flight with any cushion for security. His phone buzzed with a call from his assistant, Jennifer. "Richard, I've got the Spencer Group on hold. They want to discuss the terms." "Transfer them to Anderson. He can handle it." "Are you sure? They specifically asked for you, I'm sure." "I'm not available right now." There was a pause. "Is everything okay? You never defer calls like this." "Everything's fine. I'll check in when I'm at the airport." He hung up and looked out the window. The rain had settled into a steady pour, the kind that could last for hours. Through the kitchen door, he could hear Grace laughing at something, the sound bright and genuine. When she came back out, she was carrying 2 slices of pie. "Apple, fresh from the oven. This one really is on the house because I want an unbiased opinion." She sat down across from him again, sliding one plate over. The pie was still warm, the crust golden and flaky. Richard took a bite and closed his eyes. "This is incredible. Mom's secret is the butter. Real butter, none of that margarine nonsense, and a touch of cinnamon in the crust. You didn't make this. I helped, but the crust is all her. I'm still learning that part. My fillings are better, though. You should try my cherry pie sometime." "I don't think I'll be back through Millbrook," Richard said, and the words felt wrong as soon as he said them. Grace's smile faded slightly. "No, I guess not. New York's a long way from here." They ate in comfortable silence for a moment, and then Grace asked, "Do you have family in New York?" "My parents retired to Connecticut. I have a sister in Boston. Close family, we talk. Not as much as we probably should." "What about friends? Girlfriend?" He looked up at her directness. "No girlfriend. Friends, a few. Mostly people I work with." "That sounds lonely." "It's efficient." Grace leaned back, studying him with those green eyes. "You know what I think, Richard from New York? I think you're so busy being efficient that you forgot how to enjoy things. You don't know me. No, but I know the look. You've been checking your phone every 5 minutes since you got here, even though you're supposed to be waiting out a storm. When was the last time you just sat somewhere and did nothing? Richard wanted to argue, but he couldn't remember. Even on vacation, which he rarely took, he was answering emails and taking calls. That's what I thought, Grace said softly. This pie doesn't taste as good if you're thinking about work while you eat it. Trust me, I've tested this theory. How did you get so wise? Richard asked, and he was genuinely curious. Small town living. You learn to appreciate the moment because there's not always a lot happening. And Mom always says that life moves fast enough without us rushing it along. The front door chimed, and a couple with 2 kids came in, shaking off rain. Grace stood up reluctantly. Duty calls, but think about what I said. Richard watched her greet the family with warmth, getting the kids set up with coloring pages and crayons while taking the parents' orders. She moved through the work with grace, making everyone feel welcome and seen. It was a skill he'd never mastered, treating people as people rather than chess pieces in his business strategy. His phone buzzed again. The Spencer Group. He sent it to voicemail. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and Richard realized he needed to make a decision about his flight. He pulled up the airline app, looking at later options. There was a 9 o'clock flight that would still get him home tonight, just later. Before he could second-guess himself, he changed his booking. When Grace came back by, he said, "I switched my flight. Looks like I have more time." Her face lit up. "Good, because I'm about to make my famous grilled cheese for dinner service and you can't leave Millbrook without trying it. It's just grilled cheese. You'd think that, but you would be wrong. It's a religious experience." He laughed, actually laughed, and Grace's smile widened. "There it is. I was wondering if you knew how." "How to what?" "Laugh. You've been so serious. I have a lot of responsibilities." "Everyone does. That doesn't mean you can't laugh once in a while." The family kept Grace busy for the next half hour, and Richard found himself not minding the wait. He answered a few emails but found his attention wandering to Grace, the way she interacted with the kids, patient and playful. One of them showed her a drawing, and she made a big show of how impressed she was, pinning it on a board behind the counter that was covered with similar artwork. When the family left, and the diner was empty again except for them, Franny came out of the kitchen. "Grace, I'm heading upstairs to rest my feet. You good down here?" "I'm good, Mom." "Nice meeting you, Richard. You take care in that storm." After Franny left, Grace started prepping for the dinner service even though it was still early. Richard got up from his booth and walked to the counter, sitting on one of the stools. "So tell me about this grilled cheese," he said. Grace's eyes sparkled. "It's all about the cheese blend. Sharp cheddar, Gruyere, and just a touch of Parmesan. 3 different types of cheese with 3 different melting points creates layers of flavor and texture. And you butter the bread on the outside, obviously, but the secret is adding a little mayonnaise too, makes it extra crispy. Mayonnaise. Trust me. And you grill it low and slow so the cheese melts perfectly before the bread burns. It's science and art combined. You're really passionate about grilled cheese." "I'm passionate about food, about making something that brings people joy, even if it's simple. There's value in that." Richard found himself nodding. "My grandfather started with one small factory. He always said there was dignity in making things that people needed that lasted. I think I forgot that somewhere along the way." "What happened?" "Business school, Wall Street expectations, shareholders who only care about quarterly reports. It stops being about the product and starts being about the numbers." Grace started preparing his sandwich, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Why do you do it if it doesn't make you happy?" Because it's what I'm good at. Because my father built on what my grandfather started, and now it's my responsibility to keep building. But what do you want? The question hung in the air between them. Richard didn't have an answer because no one had asked him that before. Everyone assumed he wanted what he had worked for, the success and the power and the wealth. I don't know, he admitted quietly. Grace placed the grilled cheese in front of him, golden and perfect. That's honest at least. Try this. He took a bite and she was right. It was transcendent. The cheese was gooey and rich, the bread crispy and buttery. It was comfort food elevated to an art form. Okay, you win. This is incredible. Told you. Food is better when it's made with care, when you're not rushing through it. They talked while he ate, easy conversation that ranged from her childhood in Millbrook to his college years at Princeton. She told him about her plans to expand the diner's catering business, about wanting to travel but feeling tied to helping her mother. He told her about the pressure of living up to his family legacy, about the loneliness of being at the top. You know what I think you need, Grace said as she cleaned up his plate. A break. A real one where you turn off your phone and just exist for a while. I can't do that. Why not? The company won't fall apart without you for a few days, and if it does, then you've got bigger problems than taking a vacation. Richard wanted to argue, but she had a point. He had capable people working for him. The company ran smoothly because he'd built good systems. Maybe he'd made himself too indispensable, or maybe he'd just convinced himself he was. When was the last time you took a break? He asked Grace. Touché. But I'm not the one who looks like he's about to crack from stress. I don't look like that. She raised an eyebrow. Richard, you've got tension in your shoulders that I can see from here, and you've checked your watch 6 times in the last 10 minutes even though you changed your flight. He consciously relaxed his shoulders. Fine. Maybe I'm a little stressed. A little. Honey, your wound tighter than a spring. The door chimed again, and a small rush of dinner customers came in. Grace moved into action, and Richard watched her work. She was efficient but never rushed, taking time to chat with each person to make them feel valued. These weren't just customers to her. They were neighbors, friends, people she genuinely cared about. He thought about his own business, the impersonal nature of corporate acquisitions and board meetings. When had he last looked someone in the eye and cared about their day? When had work been about people instead of profit margins? His phone buzzed with another call. His father this time. Richard hesitated, then answered. Richard, Jennifer said you deferred the Spencer call. What's going on? I'm handling it, Dad. Anderson is perfectly capable of discussing terms. That's not the point. They expect you to be hands-on. That's what sets us apart. I know, but I'm still in South Carolina. There was a storm. So take the call from there. This is important. Richard looked at Grace, who was laughing at something an older customer had said, her whole face bright with joy. I know it's important, but I've got it under control. Trust me. There was a long pause. All right, but don't let this deal slip away because you're distracted. After he hung up, Richard felt the familiar weight of expectation settling back onto his shoulders. Grace noticed immediately when she came by with a coffee refill. Bad call. Just my father reminding me what's important. And what's that? Business. Always business. Grace sat down on the stool next to him, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something light and floral. Can I tell you something? My dad died when I was 15. Heart attack, completely unexpected. He used to work all the time, always planning for the future, saving for retirement. He never took that trip to Alaska he always talked about. Never learned to play the guitar that sat in our closet. He was always going to do those things later. I'm sorry, Richard said, meaning it. Thank you, but my point is that later never came for him. And I watched my mom struggle with that, with all the things they never did because they were waiting for the right time. So now she makes sure to live in the present, to enjoy the small things, and she taught me the same. But you still have responsibilities. The diner, your mom. Of course. But I don't let the responsibilities become my whole life. There's a balance. Richard wanted that balance. Looking at Grace, sitting in this warm diner while rain drummed on the roof, he felt something shift inside him, a longing for something he couldn't quite name. How do you do it? He asked. Find that balance. You decide what matters and you protect it. For me, it's family, this place, and making sure I take time for things that feed my soul. Baking, reading, spending time with people I care about. What feeds your soul, Richard? He didn't have an answer, and the realization shook him. When had he stopped having interests outside of work? He used to love sailing, used to paint sometimes. Those things had fallen away as the demands of the company grew. I used to sail, he said finally. Haven't been out on the water in 3 years. Then that's where you start. You make time for it. It's not that simple. It is, though. You're the boss, right? You make the rules. If you want to take a Saturday and go sailing, who's going to stop you? The board, shareholders, my father. Or maybe just you. Maybe you're the one stopping yourself. Before Richard could respond, the dinner rush picked up, and Grace had to get back to work. But her words stayed with him, challenging everything he'd built his life around. He ordered another cup of coffee and watched the rain, thinking about sailing and painting and all the things he'd sacrificed for success. Around 7, the storm finally started to let up. Richard checked his phone and saw he'd have to leave soon to make even his later flight. The thought of getting back in the car, driving to Charleston, flying back to his empty apartment in Manhattan, filled him with an unexpected dread. Grace came over with his check. Looks like you'll make your flight after all. Yeah, looks like it. She hesitated, then said, This might be forward, but would you want to stay for dinner? Real dinner, not just diner food. Mom makes pot roast on Thursdays and there's always plenty. Richard looked at the check, then at Grace, at her hopeful expression and the warmth in her eyes. He thought about his apartment, his empty schedule for the evening, the emails that would still be there in the morning. I'd like that, he heard himself say. Grace's smile was radiant. Good, let me tell Mom, she'll be thrilled. While Grace went upstairs, Richard pulled out his phone and changed his flight again. There was a morning flight at 9 that would get him back to New York by lunch. One night. He could give himself one night. Grace came back down with Franny, who insisted Richard come up to their apartment above the diner for proper dinner. Can't have you eating at the counter like a customer when you're a guest, she said. Their apartment was cozy and lived in, with family photos on every surface and the smell of pot roast filling the air. Franny set Richard up in the living room while she and Grace finished preparing dinner, and he found himself looking at the photos. Grace as a little girl, gap-toothed and grinning. A man who must have been her father, his arm around Franny, both of them young and happy. Grace in a high school graduation gown. Pictures of a life fully lived, fully loved. Dinner was around a small table in the kitchen, and it was one of the best meals Richard had ever had. Not because the food was fancy, though it was delicious, but because of the company. Franny told stories about running the diner, about the town characters and the changes she'd seen over 30 years. Grace chimed in with her own memories, and they both drew Richard into the conversation with genuine interest in his life. So you really run a big company? Franny asked. What's that like? Honestly, stressful. Rewarding sometimes, but mostly stressful. Grace tells me you haven't taken a real break in years. That true? Richard glanced at Grace, who shrugged unapologetically. It's true. Well, that's no way to live, Franny said firmly. You'll burn out, and then where will you be? Life's too short to spend it all working. That's what I told him, Grace said. Smart girl, my daughter, you should listen to her. After dinner, Grace offered to show Richard around town, even though it was dark and still drizzling. They walked down Main Street, which was charming in a timeless way, with old buildings and local shops. Grace pointed out her favorite spots: the bookstore where she'd spent countless hours as a kid, the park where the town held summer concerts, the old movie theater that still showed classics on weekends. "It's not New York," she said as they stood under an awning watching the rain, "but it's home." "It's nice," Richard said. "Peaceful. You say that like it's a foreign concept. Maybe it is. My life is all noise and urgency. This is different." Grace turned to face him, and in the dim streetlight she looked beautiful. "Can I ask you something? And I want an honest answer." "Okay. Are you happy? With your life, with all the success and the company? Are you happy?" Richard had been asked a lot of questions in his life, tough questions in negotiations and board meetings. But this simple question from Grace felt like the hardest one he'd ever faced. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think I am." Grace's expression softened. "Then maybe it's time to figure out what would make you happy." "What if I don't know?" "Then you start exploring. Try new things. Or try old things you gave up. You've got resources most people don't have. Use them for something that matters to you, not just to shareholders." They walked back to the diner slowly, and Richard found himself not wanting the evening to end. At the door, Grace said, "There's a motel about a mile down the road if you need a place to stay, or the couch upstairs folds out." "I should probably get a room, probably, but for what it's worth, I'm glad the storm trapped you here." "Me too." Grace reached out and squeezed his hand, and the touch sent electricity through him. "Have a safe flight tomorrow, Richard, and think about what we talked about." "I will." He drove to the motel in a daze, checked into a basic room that was nothing like the luxury hotels he usually stayed in, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. His phone sat on the nightstand, full of unread messages and missed calls. But for the first time in years, he didn't care. He thought about Grace's question, about happiness and what it meant. He thought about her smile and her wisdom and the way she seemed to genuinely enjoy her life, despite its simplicity. He thought about the diner, warm and welcoming, and the way Franny had treated him like family after knowing him for just a few hours. Somewhere around midnight, Richard made a decision. He picked up his phone and sent an email to Jennifer, asking her to clear his schedule for the next week. Then he changed his flight again, this time canceling it entirely. In the morning, he drove back to the diner. It was early, just past 7, but the lights were on and he could see movement inside. When he walked in, Grace looked up from where she was setting up for breakfast service, surprise and something else, something hopeful crossing her face. "Richard, I thought you'd be on a plane." "I canceled my flight." "Why?" He walked to the counter, suddenly nervous in a way he never was in board meetings or negotiations. "Because you asked me what would make me happy, and I think I want to find out. And I think maybe it starts here. With you. With taking a chance on something that doesn't make logical sense, but feels right anyway." Grace's smile started slow and then spread across her whole face. "That might be the least efficient thing you've ever done. Probably. But you also said I needed to stop being so efficient." She came around the counter and stood in front of him. "So what's your plan?" "I don't have one. I'm just going to stay for a while if that's okay. Get to know this town. Get to know you better. Figure out what I want instead of what everyone expects from me." "How long is a while?" "I don't know. As long as it takes." Grace reached up and touched his face, her hand gentle. "That's the best answer you could have given." He kissed her then, unable to help himself, and she kissed him back with a sweetness that made his heart race. When they pulled apart, they were both smiling. "Mom's going to love this," Grace said. "She already said last night that she liked you." "What about you? Do you like me?" "I like you, Richard Everett. even if you are a workaholic millionaire who doesn't know how to relax. Wait, how did you know about the millionaire part? Grace laughed. I Googled you last night. Richard Everett, CEO of Everett Holdings, net worth estimated at $50 million. Pretty impressive. And you didn't say anything. Why would I? It doesn't change who you are as a person, though it does explain the expensive watch and the fancy car. Richard pulled her close, feeling lighter than he had in years. I should have known you'd do your research. I'm thorough. It's one of my better qualities. Over the next few days, Richard settled into a rhythm that was completely foreign to him. He helped out at the diner during busy times, learning to make coffee the way Grace liked it, and even attempting to master her grilled cheese technique. He met the locals, who accepted him with the easy warmth of small-town people once they saw he was genuine. He took walks with Grace in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing. She told him about her dreams of expanding the diner, maybe opening a second location or starting a catering business. He told her about his company, but also about his doubts, his fears that he'd sacrificed too much for success. You know you can have both, Grace said one night as they sat on the porch of the diner, watching fireflies. You can be successful and happy. They're not mutually exclusive. How do I do that? You stop letting other people define what success means. Your father, the board, Wall Street. You decide what you want your life to look like and you build toward that. Richard knew she was right. Over the next week, he started making changes. He promoted Anderson to COO, giving him more authority and responsibility. He set up systems that didn't require his constant oversight. He even told his father that he was taking a step back, that he needed to trust the team he'd built. His father wasn't happy, but he also couldn't argue with the company's performance. Just don't lose sight of what matters, he'd said. I won't, Richard had promised. I'm just redefining what that means. 3 weeks after the storm that brought him to Millbrook, Richard made another decision. He found a property just outside of town, a farmhouse with land that needed work but had potential. He bought it without overthinking, without running the numbers or weighing the investment value. He bought it because he could imagine a life there, with space and quiet and room to breathe. Grace came with him to see it the day he closed, walking through the empty rooms with wide eyes. This is amazing, Richard, but what are you going to do with all this space? Live. Maybe get some horses, learn to be still. And your company, I'll fly back when needed. But I'm setting up a home office here. Most of what I do can be done remotely, and what can't I've got good people for. Grace turned to face him, emotion clear on her face. You're really staying. I'm really staying if you want me to. Of course I want you to. I just never thought you'd actually do it. He pulled her close, kissing her softly. You changed my life, Grace. That first day you saw through all my walls and asked me if I was happy. No one had ever asked me that, and you made me want to find the answer. And have you found the answer? I'm getting there, and I think you're a big part of it. Over the following months, Richard renovated the farmhouse while splitting his time between Millbrook and New York. He brought in designers, but insisted on doing some of the work himself, learning the satisfaction of building something with his own hands. Grace was there through all of it, offering opinions and helping paint walls and laughing at his attempts at manual labor. They fell into an easy relationship that deepened with each passing day. Richard met Grace's extended family, aunts and uncles and cousins who welcomed him warmly once they saw how happy he made Grace. He brought his own family to meet her, and while his father was skeptical at first, even he couldn't deny the change in Richard, the lightness that had replaced the constant stress. Richard discovered a passion for cooking, learning from both Grace and Franny. He found joy in the process, in creating something tangible and immediate. He started sailing again, buying a small sailboat and teaching Grace how to handle the rigging. They took weekends exploring the coast, talking about their future. On a warm evening in October, 8 months after he'd first walked into the diner, Richard took Grace back to that first booth where they'd met. The diner was closed for the night, just the two of them in the space that had become so meaningful. "I have something to ask you," Richard said, his heart pounding in a way that board meetings had never achieved. Grace's eyes widened as he got down on one knee, pulling out a ring he'd spent weeks choosing, a simple diamond that caught the light beautifully. "Grace Finley, you saw me when I was lost and showed me what life could be. You challenged me to be better, to be happier, to be more than just my work. I love you more than I knew it was possible to love someone. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Grace's face as she nodded. "Yes. Of course, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her, and it felt like coming home. Franny, who had been watching from the kitchen with her own tears, came out to hug them both, already planning the wedding. They got married the following spring in the town park, with half of Millbrook in attendance along with Richard's business associates, who were amazed at the transformation in their driven CEO. Richard's father gave a toast about how sometimes the best business decision is knowing when to invest in happiness, and everyone laughed and cheered. Grace wore a simple white dress and wildflowers in her hair, and Richard had never seen anything more beautiful. When they exchanged vows, he promised to always make time for what mattered, to never let work eclipse life, to build a future based on love and joy rather than obligation. Their honeymoon was 2 weeks of sailing down the coast, just the two of them and the open water. No phones, no emails, no obligations. Just time together, talking and laughing and planning their future. When they returned, Grace announced she was pregnant. Richard cried, overwhelmed with a happiness he hadn't known existed. They painted the nursery together in the farmhouse, arguing good-naturedly about colors and themes. Franny started knitting baby blankets, making enough for triplets, though Grace insisted it was just one. Richard continued running his company, but with a different philosophy. He prioritized work-life balance for all his employees, implemented policies that supported families, and focused on sustainable growth rather than aggressive expansion. His board grumbled at first, but the company thrived, attracting top talent who wanted to work somewhere that valued them as people. Their daughter, Rosemary, was born on a snowy December morning, with Richard holding Grace's hand through every moment. When they placed the baby in his arms, he looked down at her tiny face and felt his whole world shift again. This was what mattered. This love, this family, this life they were building together. Grace went back to work at the diner part-time, with Franny thrilled to babysit and spoil her granddaughter. They hired additional help, and Grace finally launched the catering business she'd dreamed about, with Richard's support and business expertise. It grew quickly, becoming known throughout the region for exceptional food and service. On Rosemary's first birthday, they held a party at the farmhouse, now fully renovated and filled with warmth and laughter. Richard stood on the porch, watching Grace play with their daughter while friends and family filled their home, and marveled at how much his life had changed. His assistant Jennifer, who had made the trip from New York, came to stand beside him. "You know, when you first canceled that flight, I thought you'd lost your mind," Richard laughed. "I probably did in the best possible way. Well, I've never seen you happier, and the company's doing great, so I guess crazy worked out. It wasn't crazy. It was the sanest thing I ever did." That evening, after everyone had left and Rosemary was asleep, Richard and Grace sat on their porch swing watching the stars. "You ever miss it?" Grace asked. "The fast pace, the intensity of New York." Richard thought about it honestly. "Sometimes I miss the energy." But I don't miss the emptiness. That life looked impressive from the outside but felt hollow. What we have here, this is real. I'm glad you got caught in that storm. Me too. Best detour of my life. Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. You know what Rosemary's first word should be? What? Efficient. Just to prove she's your daughter. Richard laughed, the sound carrying into the night. How about love instead? That seems more appropriate. Love works. Definitely love. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from deep connection and trust. Richard thought about the man he'd been, rushing through that storm to make a flight back to a life that wasn't really living. That man wouldn't recognize him now, and he was grateful for it. 2 years later, they welcomed a son, James, who had Richard's dark hair and Grace's green eyes. The farmhouse filled with the chaos and joy of 2 young children, and Richard embraced every moment of it. He coached Rosemary's soccer team, taught both kids to sail, and filled their home with the laughter and love he'd missed in his own childhood. Grace expanded the catering business, eventually opening a small cafe in town that became a local favorite. She balanced motherhood and entrepreneurship with the same grace she brought to everything, and Richard supported her dreams as completely as she'd supported his transformation. Franny remained a central figure in their lives, the matriarch who held the family together with love and pot roast and wisdom. She closed the diner on her 70th birthday, ready to retire and spend more time with her grandchildren. The town threw her a party that lasted an entire weekend, celebrating a woman who had fed them and loved them for 40 years. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Richard took Grace back to the diner, which had been purchased by a young couple who promised to maintain its character. They sat in that first booth, and Richard pulled out a small gift. "What's this?" Grace asked, unwrapping it to find a framed photo of them from that first day, taken by Franny without them knowing. They were talking across the booth, Richard looking at Grace with an expression that even then showed the beginning of love. "Mom gave this to me when we got engaged," Richard explained. "She said she knew the moment she took it that something special was happening. I had it framed because I never want to forget how it started, how you saved me." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "You saved yourself, Richard. You just needed someone to ask the right questions. No, we saved each other. You showed me what life could be, and I gave you the support to pursue your dreams. We're a team, the best team." They kissed across the booth, and the young couple running the diner smiled at the romance of it, not knowing they were witnessing the anniversary of something that had changed 2 lives completely. As they drove home to their farmhouse, to their children and their life together, Richard felt a contentment that surpassed anything his business success had ever brought. He thought about that storm, about the decision to pull off the road, about walking into a small town diner that had become the beginning of everything that mattered. He thought about Grace asking him if he was happy, and now he could answer with complete certainty. Yes, he was happy. Not because his company was successful or his investments were solid, but because he'd learned what really mattered. Love, family connection, living each day with purpose and presence. That night, tucking Rosemary and James into bed, he told them about the storm that brought him to Millbrook, about meeting their mother in the diner, about the pie and the conversation that changed everything. "So Mommy made you stay?" Rosemary asked, her eyes wide. "Mommy made me want to stay. There's a difference. She showed me what was important." "What's that, Daddy?" "Love. Always love." After the kids were asleep, Richard and Grace stood in their kitchen, cleaning up from dinner and talking about their days. It was ordinary and beautiful, the kind of moment Richard used to rush past in his old life. Now he savored it, knowing that these quiet moments of connection were the foundation of happiness. "I was thinking," Grace said as they finished, Maybe we should take a family sailing trip this summer. Just the four of us for a whole week. I love that idea. Where should we go? Somewhere new. Somewhere we can explore together. Richard pulled her into his arms, kissing her forehead. As long as I'm with you, anywhere sounds perfect. And it was perfect. This life they'd built from a chance encounter and a canceled flight. Richard had learned that sometimes the best things in life come from letting go of the plan, from being open to unexpected detours, from choosing love over efficiency and connection over success. He'd walked into that diner a millionaire who had everything except what mattered. He'd left it a man who understood that wealth wasn't measured in dollars but in moments, in laughter, in the warmth of a hand in yours and the sound of your children's voices calling you home. The storm had brought him to Millbrook, but Grace had given him a reason to stay. And in staying, he'd found the life he never knew he needed, the happiness he'd stopped believing was possible, and the love that made everything else worthwhile. Years from now, he knew he'd look back on that rainy afternoon as the moment everything changed. Not because of a business deal or an acquisition, but because a woman with green eyes and flower on her cheek had asked him if he was happy and refused to accept anything less than the truth. That truth had set him free, had led him to this life, this love, this family. And every day, Richard woke up grateful for the storm that forced him to stop, for the diner that welcomed him in, and for the woman who saw past his walls to the man he could become. Their story wasn't about a millionaire finding romance in a small town. It was about a man finding himself, about learning that success means nothing without someone to share it with, about discovering that home isn't a place, but a person who makes you want to be better. And as Richard lay in bed that night, Grace asleep beside him and his children safe down the hall, he smiled in the darkness. He'd come to Millbrook to wait out a storm and found instead the calm after years of internal turbulence. He'd found love, purpose, and peace. He'd found everything. The millionaire had walked into a small-town diner, and the owner's daughter had shown him what really mattered. Not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through quiet wisdom, genuine care, and the simple act of asking if he was truly happy. And in answering that question, in choosing to stay and explore what happiness could mean, Richard had found not just love but a whole new life worth living. It was, he thought, as sleep claimed him, the best investment he'd ever made.